Okay, strutting or striding again along this supposed avenue of invasion to um, the question of a Heideggerian path. This time on the question of leisure in order to, um, let's say, two kinds of leisure, one connected to philosophy, the other connected to questioning. Um, I think Hannah Arendt announced that she wasn't a philosopher but a questioner, um, following the Heideggerian sense, although she was also a political philosopher in some sense. So the original notion of the leisure in both Plato and Aristotle points back to the origins of mathematics, at least the Western origin of mathematics, in the Egyptian priests, who, where we could see leisure means that they didn't have to hunt and gather, and they didn't have to concern themselves with their, I suppose, largely with their um, bodily safety, um, but in the same sense, or in some sense, somewhat analogous to a medieval uh, monk in a monastery, but I suppose quite different in its social implications and in the customs and etiquette involved and so forth, in the world they lived in. Um, these Egyptian priests were able to develop mathematics. So um, if one thinks about that, in terms of here, we have an analogy with the seed. So it's like, um, if we have a seed planted in good soil and there's some rain and the climate's right, um, it's not a freezing temperature like around the Danube River or something, but you're in a nice warm climate that's right for, let's say it's a seed for an orange tree that's right for oranges, then you get the good fruit of the orange. So then, on analogy with that, the human being is put in the conditions of leisure, or schola, school, um, and there, this knowledge of mathematics, which is knowledge of, according to the way Plato and Aristotle think about it, as something which um, always stays the same, rather than everything which changes. And so then we see how the human being, when in the right conditions, like that seed, produces the thing that it's meant to produce, which is knowledge proper. So this is a matter of having the leisure to sit in the shadows of the houses and uh, do what would appear to be something uh, which then, in the light of the distinction between the so-called contemplative life and the so-called active life, which really means the life of Socrates as opposed to the life of a statesman, um, we see these supposed highest possibilities for the human being in play, and then uh, from the point of view of the and then, strangely, as Strauss points out, Socrates seems to, well, Socrates wasn't a statesman, so he doesn't really, he's, in some way, he's in both the political life and in the leisure, the protected leisure life, which is ultimately through connection with the mathematical knowledge, which always stays the same, always the logos stays the same, as Plato is well aware. Plato, Socrates are well aware. So in the world of speech, in the world of the logos, um, so the second leisure, would be connected to the discovery, uh, which was didn't really come before Plato, because Plato wasn't interested in language. He'd probably Plato, Socrates, Aristotle only spoke Greek and maybe a few words of some other languages. Um, the awareness of that language is doing all kinds of things to our access to reality. So these questions, so for instance, it's convenient for another reason, which is that we can show where Heidegger is in keeping with the discussions happening in the Anglo-American sphere, in the sphere which still has some connection to the Oxbridge discussions, like A.J. Ayer type discussions and so on, where they have this idea that, with Wittgenstein and so on, that some questions are questions that can be resolved by showing how we're misusing language. That's another, I think I'll do that on the next recording, to try to show some connection to Heidegger's problem and the analytic part of philosophy, how they're dealing with some questions which overlap in some ways. So the questioner, just as that Egyptian priest has freed themselves from the world of, which would later on be called physis or nature, in contradistinction to psyche, or the soul. The questioner would have to free themselves properly from the arbitrariness of any particular logos in the way it is accidentally acting on them in a heteronymous way, let's say. So to begin with, that's very vague, but we'll have to see how Heidegger is trying to treat with this difficulty. Sometimes he's saying, initially he made his feint where which turned out to be in some way a fiasco, where he just tried to change its terms so that he didn't speak of Kantian autonomy, but he spoke instead of the authenticity or something like that. But then the meaning had to change too. And so the access we have to this, though, however, is in the notion that genuine future is in this so-called not yet ready to hand moment, where something hovering on the edge of let's say awareness is then brought to language so that language then begins to speak about things which hadn't been noticed before. So for instance, possibly one could think of that happening in the case of in the case of the examples I've been giving about the Japanese attitude toward the word sexuality is not moralized, that the moralization of sexuality could come in and it has a genuine future through bringing that to language, as it did happen between the break between the so-called pagans and the so-called Christians, so that the whole moralization as such would appear as the ushering in of some kind of genuine future into the common being. So we have to clarify how that works and what it looks like in greater detail. The genuine future is something behind us, something invisible. On the metaphor that the future is. So, like, you could think of Benjamin's Angel of History example with the connection to the Paul Clay stuff. Um, History, what's happened, the present is really the past. It's what stands before us and we can see it. Whereas the future is what we can't see, it's behind us. Um, but this is where time ceases to mean the movement of objects that cast shadows, and instead it switches its region, which is what Heidegger um, tries to accomplish with the juxtaposition of uh, being um, as held in the house of, of, of language, and that it can shift, like I was just trying to bring out, but that was very inadequate, so we have to look at that more closely. But okay, so I just wanted to make this just a sort of schematic distinction between philosophers and questioners. Philosophers tied to this freedom from nature, as it were, in favor of the logos, but the questioners trying to free themselves from the logos.